And the other thing you asked about, sorry, is about long-term students.
Oh, yes. Well, we can get into that question too. I found it fascinating. I can't remember which podcast it was. It might have been Teaching in Bali. It might have been that episode on your show. And we need to talk about your show at some point on our show. But you talked about, for the folks that come for the month, I think you did mention Dantian. We're just trying to get it, to form Dantian and understand where it is. But for the people that were planning on staying with you for years, you started them with just good calisthenics, it sounded like. And
exercise.
Yeah, just good old exercise. Would you kind of explain just tell us about that. Yeah. And what was it? There was a stance that you found from one of your Northern Long Fist practices that you used quite a bit that most people use in a different way. Was it? I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been a 7-star stance or something like that. I can't remember, but
there's a few views actually. Yeah. So but the long-term project is here in Bali. I mean, I've had students that have been with me. I don't know why. I've had students who've been with me 20 years. I've got no idea why. I'm more confused as to why they studied with me in the first place, because I was like a 24-year-old kid who didn't really know what he was doing, but ended up teaching. And there was all these people with a martial arts background in front of me. And I used to say to them in the class, why are you here? Like, I'm just a kid or whatever, but they stayed and they've been around for a while now. But the long-term people you're asking about now is a full-time project in Bali. And the reason that started was because I always told people I don't teach martial arts. For years, I've said I don't teach martial arts. I teach styles, because if somebody is going to come and learn Tai Chi or Bagua, to me, it's a style. It's not really a martial art in the sense that I think martial arts should start with how to stand, how to punch. I think every martial artist should be able to do cross, hook, jab, slip, kick. It doesn't matter what the style is. You have to start with that. So I think in the past, before I was doing this, people would come and they would learn Tai Chi. But when people came here to learn Tai Chi or Bagua, we didn't get to it for a long time because they had to learn external stuff first and the sort of basics of what I consider combat, which in many ways was more like boxing than anything else. So they understood the nature of such things and how to use their body. And then gradually it started to evolve into internal arts. And they're about 2 years into it at the moment, 2 years full-time training into building the foundations and only really starting to get into internal martial arts this term. So that's why I started very externally with people. And I was talking to them today, actually, or recently, that I think external martial arts you hide from people, and internal martial arts you're very exposed to people. So for me, that progress from external to internal is very important to go through those stages. So that's why with martial arts training I start very physically. Yeah, is that what you asked? Oh yes, yeah. And the stances, I just have a slightly different take on external stances. That's really what it is. So even though people had done martial arts before, a lot of them, I have quite a different take on what the stances are for, even things like Mabu and Gongbu than often before. So pretty much everybody who came full time had to start again, because the way I present it is very specific. So people came, and I was quite honored really. They came with lots of years of experience of doing other arts and thankfully they all seemed happy to start again. So that was good. There was no awkwardness there. So lots of Mabu and Gongbu and Pubu and things like this at the beginning to get the body open up.
Awesome. Thank you.
Nice. I was going to ask, kind of along the same lines you had mentioned, you were talking about sort of alignment in the body and how important that is. And I was going to ask you, you've said in a couple of different places, about you've talked about the 3 harmonies in particular out of 6, the sort of the 3 external harmonies. And I was going to ask you, do you think that it seems like in a lot of traditions these days that those aren't transmitted as well? Or that, the actual mechanism of teaching it and practicing it doesn't translate very well. And I just wanted to get your take on that. Do you see that as well? Or is that, whatever your take is on that? Specifically
on the harmonies, you mean? Or
yeah.
alignments in general? Harmonies, yeah. Yes. I mean, I think that not everybody, but I think commonly the harmonies are mistaken for, what do you call it, structural alignments, as in almost like vertically aligning above each other, or sort of making a sort of brace through the skeleton or something like that. And the harmonies to me are about getting regions of the body to relate to each other, which isn't quite the same. So if you take, say, shoulders and hips, for example, as two parts of the body that need to relate, with regards to transforming the body, there's a very specific way that we line up the hip and then sit the shoulder properly and then release it in a certain way so that it's almost like the tissues between the two kind of get worked and knitted together. So once they're knitted together, you have like an elastic connection. So then I can actually, or students rather, I'm on screen or not, can pull the shoulder away from the hip and they're still in harmonization with one another so that there is a fluidity and a mobility within the body. So that when people start, it's like, if we stick with shoulders and hips, for example, a common harmony that needs developing at the beginning, obviously, if people are unaware, then the torso is almost not rigid, but doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver at first because you can only relate these joints through gravity. But then gradually, as all the tissues knit up inside and all the nerves open up and all the fibers come off the spine and tie you together, then you can start to break those rules and manipulate those joints away from each other and they still relate. So my take on the harmonies is very much about this. So if we, even something like the stances, you take something like Mabu, which people wouldn't normally consider horse stance to have harmonizations in this way. To me, it does. So we line up the hips and the pelvis to do with the knees and the feet in a very specific way so that an elasticity starts to build down through the legs so that gradually you then break that principle. So as you manipulate the quad and the hips and move out of that, you still have the Mabu structure contained internally within your legs, whatever shape you make. But it's based upon knitting together this elasticated lines rather than muscular contraction or muscle memory or something like that. So my aim right from the beginning with things like harmonies on a physical level, just on a physical level, is to make people as elasticated and dense with regards to the rubbery tissues as I possibly can, so that we can then sort of manipulate this strong density in the body to create the rest of the styles, basically. It's hard to explain, isn't it, in words, but that's kind of how I try to use the harmonies.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that for example, that contrast, say, between Xingyi and Bagua, that as you were saying, sort of that elastication, that ability to begin to, the relationship can change and is much more dynamic in one art than the other? Or did you have a different take on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would also once again say that my Xingyi is definitely not pure. Like the Xingyi I was taught was modified to suit Bagua. So it's a weird one because I'll talk about the principles for a bit, but I would never feel like an authority on a very traditional lineage of Xingyi because it's Hebei Xingyi I've done, but it's definitely been, you can see the adjustments they've made to make it suit Bagua for sure. It's a little bit of a sort of Gong for Bagua, the way I was taught it. Yeah, I mean, Xingyi I use particularly the Santi structure because of that ability to create that elasticity within a very sort of tensegrity based shape is quite nice before Bagua does horrible things to it. I mean, I don't even know how anyone starts with Bagua.
Agreed.
For people. Agreed.
Yeah.
It's also because of Sung, the way that we use Sung when we practice as well. Which the way that I would define it is you have two ways for the body moving, as far as I can see, which is one is under contraction. So as the muscles contract and operate you according to leverage, that's the first way of moving. And sometimes that can be very, very intricate and complex. People do very, very beautiful things with leverage. But I would still consider that external in its function. Whereas internal martial arts would be that when I sung and I release, that all of the rubbery stuff that's connected up expands. So it stretches. So when I switch off the outside and hang the muscles from the bone, so then the sort of large muscle groups aren't used, when I release, then all the rubbery tissue starts to manipulate from inside, from expansion. And that's how we mobilize the body physically within at least the way that I do Tai Chi or Bagua. For sure. So even when I'm teaching something like long fist, right at the beginning, I'm still wanting them to get rid of all of the contraction and all of the physical binding up and connect up these rubbery lines that I know I'm going to use later for the internal arts to get them to mobilize this force. Is that similar to how you use it, or a different take on it, or?
No, that's very similar. Yeah.
Okay.
I always appreciate hearing other systems languaging translated into English and like how that's presented. Cause you can go from system to system, even with people who are English speakers. And they'll have sort of different types of nomenclature to describe very similar things. So I've always appreciated sort of the clarity around your use of vocabulary and how you like to talk about it, because it relates very well to the things that I've learned. So yes,
that's good.
Thank you. Yeah.
I've had to develop a very simple way of talking as well, because within a class that I teach, quite normally there's 15 to 20 nationalities in there. So I've had learn. I got Russians and French and Germans and Spanish and all kinds of people. So I've had to learn to find what are the most common words that all of these languages will understand. Hence the reason rubber is rough and sinews, so that people can understand. Yeah,
that's amazing. I had never thought about that, but it makes so much sense. Yep.
Yeah, when I first started teaching, we had any idea what I was on about, because it was I didn't realize how cultural our language is. Even the metaphors I used or anything were only relevant to English people. So I had to drop all of those. Even when I taught in America, I really upset Americans several times by using sayings. Can't remember an example now, that were positive in England, and turns out they were an insult in America. And it was like a lead balloon. So I was like, oh no, I'm really sorry. I didn't know the meaning was different. So I've had to learn all those things. Yeah.
I love it.
I was going to ask, sort of in a similar way, I wanted to know about your experience with Yang Tai Chi and with Xingyi. And I was wondering if you could sort of contrast them. And specifically, I was wondering about like contrasting like the Shenfa and maybe the power generation methods, just in whatever way you choose to do that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, especially with the power development, Xingyi and Tai Chi differ in basically the intent. They both use Qi to me, and I have a very specific definition for what Qi is, to integrate the body into one unit. Xingyi's body unit is obviously a little bit more sort of pulled taut maybe than Tai Chi's in many ways, especially with Santi, the most painful taut posture ever within the internal arts. And it has that shape, and then when the Qi is mobilized, it's done under intent for me, Xingyi. So when I have a specific intent, everything starts to mobilize inside and force the body into a new shape. And hence the reason for the name Xingyi, which is, I'm definitely not telling you, I know you're not, but I know you have listeners who might not be so familiar with. So I know you're aware, but I get that people are listening. Obviously, the idea of form and intent coming together is in the name of the style, right? So the chuan, the technique is generated by the form and the mind. Forming the intent. But in Tai Chi, I don't think intent is used at all. In fact, I'm anti it. So Tai Chi for me is all about release of intent, so that you move out of intention into pure attention. And once you are purely attentive of the body, it integrates in a completely different way. So that if I wish to mobilize the force in Xingyi, it's like intent. And if I wish to mobilize the force in Tai Chi, it's let go. And then the result is that a different kind of power comes out. So I find the two are very synergistically useful to learn. But I always think that most people after a while will gravitate towards Tai Chi's power development once they're ready to let go of intent. And Bagua is more in line with Tai Chi for me. I think they're more similar in some ways. So Xingyi is kind of something that, say, for example, here in the guys who are doing martial arts full time, I went external martial arts, a little bit of Tai Chi to teach them some structure, but really Xingyi is what we focused on until intent was strong, and then starting to learn how to release that intent to mobilize the force in a different way. That was kind of how I do it. And I say Bagua till I want to confuse them, but not yet. We haven't got there yet. We haven't got there yet.
So along those lines, Damo, would you say that the attention that you're forming in Tai Chi, that reminds me of what you were talking about with touch when you were talking about push hands, where I'm not trying to put something into that other person with push hands, I am adjusting on the inside from the stimulus that they're giving me. Would you say that those two go along in line with each other?
Oh, completely. I think intent in push hands is a big error. I also aware that push hands is probably the most controversial part of Chinese martial arts. It's obviously caused all kinds of problems, and nobody even agrees on what a definition of push hands is. I mean, for some people, it's competition wrestling. For other people, it's, I don't know, exploring the realms of the fairies, and you have an entire spectrum somewhere on there, don't you? But for me with Tai Chi, one of the major components is the joining, which is the most important part of push hands. So in order to join, once, the way I would define it is once two people touch, then the person who has the most skill, or the person who is doing push hands, if you like, and the other person is the one you're touching, when they give up all intent, but they don't give up their structure, and then they release into attention, then your whole nervous system reconfigures and rearranges to join you with the other person. And then that is where push hands begins for me. And the problem with intent is the very nature of it. It creates a barrier. I mean, you only have to look at the world to see that's the case. And it's attentiveness that really causes two people to join. So Tai Chi is, or anything political and all sorts. But so Tai Chi to me is the study of releasing the barriers of yourself until you join with the other person. And that's what push hands is really about. Once that can be done, which is tricky enough, even in a semi-compliant format of the framework, it's hard enough when it's within a set pattern, then trying to take that out into less and less compliant situations is obviously the next mission. But I think that's such a hard thing in push hands that hardly any of us ever manage it, which is why it often sort of deviates into something that I see as something different. I think push hands is probably out of all of the martial arts I've studied, I think push hands is probably the most difficult part of any Asian martial arts to take to a very, very high level. And I would not claim to be at a very high level, but it's just so intricate and so complicated for me. But yes, definitely attentiveness would be the key for me for something like that.
Speaking
I don't
of
think practice I don't think there's any practice as hard as push hands as there in martial arts. So it's tricky.
Very.
Yeah. Yes.
I was going to ask what styles of Bagua that you have done in the past, and which ones do you continue to do now or teach now? Yeah,
sure. I started with not many people know this, but I actually started with Sun style when I was really young. I don't tend to mention that, but the reason was that the person who taught me was okay, but not particularly proficient, and I wasn't old enough to understand either. So Sun style was where I started, but I didn't really get it. And that's not the style. That's my shortcoming, and perhaps the teacher that was teaching me wasn't very deep into it. Then I went into Liang style, which again I didn't really understand. I'll be totally honest. I did it as a sort of twisty Shaolin. And then I ended up in Chung style, which is where whatever level of knowledge I have of it, I started to grasp it a little bit. So Chung style is where I stayed. But it kind of, I don't know. Again, it brings me back to that view that always gets me in trouble. That are you really doing Chung style? Like, are you really doing Yang style? Like, maybe you can recognize the framework on the outside, but I think that we're each doing however it is manifest through our body. So I would say that I'm doing English, 44-year-old English Chung style, I would say is pretty much what I'm doing, because especially with the internal arts, like I said something earlier about like external arts, you hide from your opponent, and internal, from the world, and internal arts, the opposite. And maybe if I sort of explore that a bit, I think that say you start external martial arts, say you want to do karate or Shaolin or something like this. Normally it's because you're a bit nervous and a bit shy, or you want to get fitter, or you want to look after yourself, or whatever. There's an insecurity there usually of some sort. So you get strong and you get fast and you get capable perhaps and things, but really deep down often the issue is not dealt with, like that insecurity is there. Maybe it can help to a certain degree, but I don't think they really touch the core. Whereas internal martial arts, because you have this thing called qi, which means you have an integration between the mind and your body via this fluid of energy inside your body, you can't hide, because in the internal martial arts, we can see everything about who you are in the way that all of the tissues move and everything shifts inside your body and the way your nervous system releases, so we can see you. So therefore, if you really want to become good at the internal arts, you have to deal with yourself. And only when you deal with yourself do you open up and the arts hit a very, very high level. Now, the problem with that is that it makes the internal martial arts very hard to learn, but also once your self comes out to any degree, then the style kind of breaks down, because now the style is you. So if Chung's style held the hand at this angle, but my body has changed inside, so my hand is at this angle, is it Chung's style anymore? I don't know. I can recognize the shape of the form and you might be able to see who taught it, but it doesn't look the same anymore. And I think that in external martial arts, there's a high degree of standardization. Your example of Japanese arts, very standardized. Some of the Wing Chun styles, very standardized. I did Wing Chun for 3 years and it was very standardized. You did it the way it was taught. Internal martial arts, every student looks different from the teacher. You can recognize there's single whip, there's white snake reach down or whatever, but it doesn't look the same because of that chi, the expression of the person that comes through. So long answer, but I do Chung style sort of. in Bagua Gun, kind of. How about you guys? What style is it?
Gao style.
Oh,
Gao
okay.
style Bagua. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, a shared heritage there for sure.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you sort of as a follow-up question to that, like, what mechanisms in Bagua do you think were or are the most beneficial for your sort of your personal cultivation, your health, sort of your energetic or psychological cultivation?
I think with regards to Bagua, I would say that if I compare it to the other styles, how much I understand Tai Chi, I understand a lot more. Bagua, Xingyi, and Tai Chi probably equally. Bagua is the one that is a constant source of confusion because, I would have to say that maybe my view on what Bagua is changes every couple of years. And the very fact that it's constantly shifting because it's such an intricate and complicated art means that I haven't stabilized into a constant understanding of it yet. Whereas Tai Chi for me is a little bit more plateaued. Like I have an idea of Tai Chi and it stays like this. So maybe aside from any of the sort of physical benefits of the twisting and the pulling and the energetic benefits of what it does with the chi inside the body, I think the main thing for me is it keeps me confused, which I think actually is a very healthy thing for a person's mindset. You should always have something in life that you struggle with, that you do, that keeps you confused and feeling, I say, small on some level. And I think for me, really, that's what Bagua is mostly for my personal benefit. That's how it benefits me anyway.
That's awesome.
The humbling art. The humbling art.
Yeah, completely. I think Bagua and push hands. Do you think stay humble in the Eastern martial arts for sure? Yeah.
And do you think that the Dantian development in Bagua is similar to your maybe Yang style or any of the other arts that you've practiced, or is it different, or how is it different?
Sure. Well, Dantian is a strange term because it's different in every one of the arts, right? I mean, what tended to happen in Chinese arts is that they borrow terminology to represent like an area of your body. So the Dantian is a part of Tai Chi and a part of alchemy, but they're not the same Dantian. And it's a part of Bagua. So Dantian, from a martial perspective, the martial Dantian, I would say that actually Tai Chi to me, Yang style especially, the one I know best, is 3 frames, large, medium, and small frame. Large frame has and to me, that's not the size of the postures. Large frame can be done with a small posture or a big posture. Small frame can be done with a small posture or a big posture, although it's quite tricky. It doesn't matter. The frame to me is the way that the insides of your body are mobilizing. Large frame in Tai Chi is a very specific way of moving. And then middle frame is more complicated. And then small frame is very, very intricate. And Bagua is more similar to the small frame way of moving in Tai Chi, which is partly why Bagua is so complicated, because it doesn't have large or medium first. It jumps you straight in at the deep end and the far end. So I would say that actually the Dantian in Bagua operates more like very, very high level Tai Chi, like Tai Chi when it hits small frame level practicing, which to me means that more operated from the center of the diaphragm and the solar plexus region of the body, and more very much about these very tight and small spirals that release as you swung through the inside of the torso space, which to me is very much like small frame Tai Chi, Yang style way.
Cool. Great answer. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, I don't do Yang style. I don't really do much Tai Chi at all. So it's always fascinating to hear sort of contrast between somebody who has practiced both of them quite a bit.
Yang style is underestimated, I really think Yang style is the most intricate of the Tai Chi systems, actually, out of all of them. I studied Chen Village style and Hunyuan style, and a couple of others, actually. But in the end, Yang style was the one that people underestimate because they think it's the simplest. Actually, Yang style is very intricate, especially once it starts to go through the frames. So a very fascinating style.
And how would you contrast? Oh no, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I'll do it quick. One of my favorite Damo Mitchell, and I want to say it's got the copyright is, it's a term. It's a term. We were talking about, we were talking about terminology, and it's one of those. I'm like, oh, you're talking about Damo Mitchell and his work is mobilizing the chi. Would you explain what that is to you and how you teach that, respectively in your Qigong, Nei Gong, and then the internal arts and how did you come up with that? Where did you find that? And
Oh, well, mobilizing the chi actually is quite a traditional term in some styles, Yang style especially. So, for example, if you see someone, like my friend, Adam Meisner, who's quite well known and also controversial, he gets some trouble. In the Yang Tai Chi world, he will talk about mobilizing the chi as well. And within Nei Gong systems, they will talk about mobilizing the chi. So I can't claim credit for it. Definitely not. It's been around a while. But it's a very important part of the process. So, it's different within the arts. Maybe I could define chi as I see it. Maybe first.
Please do.
Let me keep it, like I say, or a summarized version. I don't believe this whole idea that chi doesn't have a definition. I don't think that's true. So often you will read people say there's no way to define chi. I think there's only no way to define chi if you don't ask what context it's in. So if, for example, you wanted to define chi in feng shui, Chinese medicine, Tai Chi, alchemy, society, I don't know, all of the different things, then it would be very difficult to come up with a definition of chi because chi in feng shui is not the same as chi in Tai Chi. But within the context of an art, chi has a very specific definition to me. So in something like Qigong, for example, there's two forms of cultivated chi that are separate from health. One of those is a yang qi, which basically is increased electrical energy in your nervous system. So there is a higher degree of movement through the nerves, which will mobilize the body in a different way. So within internal martial arts, to me, a lot of the kind of the liquid looking flesh that moves under the skin, the sort of what I call the creepy body, to the dismay of my students, when everything sort of around, is because your nervous system has received a higher degree of energy, but therefore the sort of micro movements on the inside of your body are increased. So when we mobilize the yang qi, what we're doing is basically waking up all of the connective tissues and nervous system to mobilize your body in another way. And then with regards to yin qi, that's where it gets a little bit more weird because it's a form of magnetism that is built up inside your body that is gathered around a center. And that magnetism at first is not strong enough to affect your body, but once it starts to get thick and dense, it starts to pull and distort your body in a spherical fashion. So it reshapes you on the inside. So brief answer. When the two meet each other and interact, what you get is this increased circulation of magnetism and electricity through your body. Now, it's not literal magnetism, it's not literal electricity, but that's the experience of is that it goes through you on a dense level. And then as you go further into the subtle levels of the arts, then it turns into something else that can come out of the body or occupy a space or something like this. Now, in an art like Tai Chi, that definition I gave for chi to me is probably far enough. Like that's basically what you're trying to do. So when I sink the chi, as you say, what we're doing is descending the mass inside the body to realign the tissues in a particular way so that this energy can coagulate in your body and then it starts to wake up the insides. And this to me is the kind of start point for the internal martial arts. And that's what I mean by mobilizing the chi. Sorry, long answer. So
that's great. That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yep.
Rubbery tissue and knit it together by something like the harmonies, then when all that energy, that magnetism starts to mobilize the insides, then all the tissues will stretch. And now you have access to moving the insides. And that's sort of Tai Chi, Bagua, Xingyi, very much on that kind of idea. So that's how I would talk about mobilizing the chi. But if then you're going to go further into the sort of higher end of it, then it's something else, because it can come in and out of your body. And it's the arts as a natural skeptic when I was younger of everything and anyone, definitely authority figures, but definitely skeptical of anything esoteric. It was surprisingly pleasant to discover that actually all of the esoteric things they talk about are in fact true. They're just almost lost with regards to skills, but it is possible for the energetics to go very far in these arts. And also very humbling to discover that they can do this for me.
Do you think
Absolutely.
if anybody, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you think that skill, if somebody had the time and the proper teacher with a proper method, do you think that skill is accessible to anybody?
Yes. Well, hang on. Which skill?
The mobilizing of the chi, the finding of, and then the creating of the chi and the dantian. Do you think that those skills, if they had the time and they had a proper teacher and a proper method, and the teacher had a proper method, and they put in the work as a student, do you think that is accessible to anybody?
Yes, 99% of people. And my, just to use my teaching as an example, and I'm certainly not claiming to be a master of the system or anything, but I'll have a course with 200 people on it sometimes, and every single one of them can mobilize the chi once the dantian is formed and the insides will wake up. Like it's not that hard if the method is correct, and the mindset is correct, which is actually not that hard to achieve. No, it can be done for sure, and in quite a short space of time. That kind of become the specialism that I started working on with people. The only ones that struggle is there's a few health conditions that get in the way a little bit. For example, diabetes can be a little bit tricky. If somebody is diabetic to the point of needing insulin, it seems to be very difficult to do the initial gathering. So we have to support a little bit with Chinese medicine and herbs, and then they can. They need some external tonics to help them a little bit. And sometimes if people are incredibly deficient on the level of blood from a Chinese medicine perspective, it can be a little tricky. But again, we can support it with herbs. So sometimes people need a little bit of outside assistance, but then if they have the method, yeah, for sure. Yeah, no problem at all.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, no worries.
I was going to ask you along the same lines of teaching, what influences or experiences were most helpful for you in transmitting, being able to transmit the knowledge that you have and grow yourself in your own practice along the way. It's kind of two questions, but
yeah, there's a couple there, isn't it? Hang on, what experiences helped in the? I do apologize.
Yeah, no. What experiences were the most influential? Sorry, it's early.
Words are hard.
For helping you to clearly transmit what you know. I'll just leave it at that.
I think if anything, a couple of things. One, the credit must go to the people who taught me. Absolutely. I mean, they did the hard work in trying to explain to what I was a very difficult student. So, thanks to them for having the patience. And then if anything from myself, I think more than anything, two things. One, I'm very enthusiastic and absolutely obsessively fascinated in the art. So that I think the very fact that 100% of my life is embroiled in this. I mean, I'm a full-time obsessive on these arts. And this is all I do. So I think sometimes that can be, it can catch that enthusiasm. And I think that helps me to sort of get to people and help them to get these things going. And I think the other thing is just trial and error over lots of time, trying to work with a lot of people and trying to get them to understand. And I would say like the first 10 years of my teaching, 10 years of my teaching, I was still finding out how to explain to people and how to systematically take them into the process. And I didn't do a very good job. So the people who've been with me for a lot of years, I apologize to them on a regular basis. But gradually, by sort of seeing how I could get people into it, trial and error enabled me to learn, okay, this is what people struggle with. This is what they need to do. This is how I can do it. And it just sort of developed over time. I mean, ideally, if I could scrub the first 10 years of Lotus Gong's history from records and memory, I would do it. But I can't do that, unfortunately. Never mind.
So as you've gotten better as a teacher, do you feel like it's sort of helped to either shorten or compress the learning curve for your students?
Yeah. Either I'm completely useless or I'm explaining it better because they're learning a lot faster than I did. It's for sure. And I would say as well that I don't know, maybe you attract a different kind of person in different phases of your life in teaching as well, don't you? I'm sure that's the same with social groups and lovers and all kinds of things, but you attract a different group. And I think when I started teaching, who did I get? Lost souls a little bit. Apologies to people from back then. And I don't even mean that as a criticism, but I think I was a lost soul too. So I think that was inevitable. And gradually as I've gone on, I tend to draw a different kind of crowd. So I tend to get people that are incredibly pleasant. I feel very lucky to be surrounded by the people I'm surrounded by, lovely students. I was only looking at them today thinking, I really like all you guys. But it's also the people who come are very, very fascinated in the subject and want to get to the bottom of it. And I think that speeds up their process as well. Lotus Gong is, or at least my branch of it, because there's other people who teach that I've taught and they do their own thing. But there's certainly the branch I teach is definitely a branch for obsessives and fanatics. Like that's who I tend to attract. So it makes them very easy to teach, to be perfectly honest. Whereas I have people who I taught that have a far better demeanor for people that are a bit more casual, and they tend to attract those people. So I've got all the nutcases in the branch here. Lovely nutcases, yeah.
If you could take a time machine, and go back,
it. Yeah.
Maybe put a young Damo in a headlock a little bit, but if you could tell him something, the 24-year-old Damo, as opposed to the 44-year-old Damo, as a teacher, what is one piece of advice that you would give him, and maybe the audience too, as teachers, not just practitioners? What is a big piece of teaching advice that you would give?
Well, the first thing I say to myself is don't be a twat, because when I look back on who I was when I was first teaching, I shouldn't have been teaching. But I would say on a more practical level, I think that when I first started teaching amplifies many things. And I think one of the things it amplifies is your insecurities. So I think it's a curse, a blessing and a curse to teach. And I think that if I'm very critical of myself and who I was, if I'm in this time machine, I may as well criticize myself. A lot of my insecurities come out. So there was a constant need to prove myself to the people I was teaching and to the people there, and to always make everything really impressive. And the problem with it was that it did a little bit of a disservice, because the teaching becomes focused on yourself as a teacher rather than on the students. And once you kind of realize that nobody is judging you that much, and you can drop all of those insecurities, you can actually get further involved in assisting the people that are there to learn. So I would probably just tell myself to relax and not worry, and make the teaching less about myself and more about them. And I would have done a better job. And probably people around me did tell me that when I was teaching, and I probably didn't listen. But that would be the advice I would have. If I were to be critical, I think sometimes teachers make the teaching about themselves and the school about themselves rather than the people that they're teaching. And I think that is a terrible shame. A terrible shame.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Other than that, I'd probably be quite hard on myself, but there you go. I deserve it.
So
what's your advice to yourself? You teach. Would you also?
Yeah. Honestly, I've always liked all my students. We don't always, because I've taught since almost the same time. One of my biggest things was, and I'm going to say it from an external perspective because of the Wing Chun. I had developed, of course, external, a relaxed state, but I had access to my full body frame, right? Mm-hmm. So when I was doing the movements, my arms might be moving, but I had access to my mass. And for my first student, it was a private student for almost 3 years. I couldn't explain the relaxed state that I was in, not limp. I call it relaxed. I call it al dente because I'm an eater, right? I like if it's overcooked, it's not going to hold any sauce that's going to melt. And if it's hard, it's brittle. It's the uncooked noodle. It's going to snap. So I call it that al dente state. But when I would hold out my hands, and we would cross hands, he's like, oh, well, he's hard and he's stiff. Well, no, that was my skeletal structure he was feeling, but it was also my mass. So for my very first student for the first 3 years, I couldn't explain to them what I was doing. And so a lot of it was for me as a teacher, I needed to spend more time maybe with the practice and develop terminology to pass on the skill. Mm-hmm. And over the course of 20 years, I have changed my starting students, what they practice, about 7 times. Which sounds insane, It's not like I'm throwing everything out the window. It's like, where do I start them? My teacher has my Wing Chun teacher has a great saying. He's like, the level to mastery, whatever it is, you can never shorten that curve. That is the individual's practice, and that's a lifelong practice. But like what Owen was talking about you with the beginning students, he's like, but you can always refine and maybe shorten the curve of barrier to entry. And so now, after my 7th iteration of where and how do I start the student, I'm really finding that I have a good terminology developed, with the traditional, Cantonese, of course, and using the proper, Cantonese terminology, but also things that a student, whether they're a mother or a bus driver or a carpenter, things that they can relate. I haven't dumbed the system down at all, but I've made it more accessible on a verbal scale. So a lot of mine was finding the proper terminology to express it. And then what do I start with? Am I starting pure application, or do I look at how to develop the frame, how to develop the posture, understanding of proper relaxation, which is going to be different for each of the arts. That concept of relaxation and what you need to express that system is going to be different. So that was my big learning curve. So yeah, I don't know.
Well, that's good. I like al dente. That works for me. I'm a fan.
Take it, use it.
I will. It's stolen. There you go. I'll give you credit.
I have a friend that says, okay, I'll give you credit once. And then the second time I give you partial credit. Then the third time I say something, it's like, by the way, I invented this new thing. So third time, it's all yours.
But I won't get away with it because I'm British. We're notorious for bad food. So I know al dente didn't come from me anyway. So.
Owen, I've only got one more question for our friend today, and I'll save it. So yeah, if you want to go with yours, and then mine's the weird one. Do you want a weird question, Damo? I could sneak in the odd question.
Sure. Yeah. Go for it. Whatever. Yeah.
Do you think that chi and the mobilization of chi?
Yeah.
Do you think that is a next state of human evolution, or do you think that is a gift from nature that's always been there?
Ooh, a gift from nature. I think it's a bit of both. I think the potential for it is contained within every single person. I think that the basis for Eastern, maybe spiritual arts or cultivation arts, whatever you want to call them, has long been to find this potential that sits hidden within each and every one of us. That's very much my belief. So I think it's a bit of both of those things. Is it evolution? I think if I can pick apart that word, I think the body can transform. I think your energetics can evolve. But I think spiritual attainment is a revelation and happens on the spot. So I think that or it doesn't. That's the other option, isn't it? And I think that the mobilization of qi is a potential that's within each and every one of us. And sometimes the length we have to go to in order to achieve it is very, very high. But yeah, would it evolve if the whole human species had qi mobilization? Would that be good? No, they probably still argue about stuff on the internet. It probably wouldn't change anything.
I love it. I love it.
I was going to ask you, I know that most systems, and I'm sure you've learned many, many weapons over time. Do you continue to include weapons in your curriculum?
Yeah, some. I will say the practicality of weapons. The problem is, traveling for over 2 decades or something. And so weapons are always going to be a difficulty. So I think most of the other people I know have traveled around Asia studying in different places. Normally the weapons fall by the wayside. So I kept some. So I used to do the bow staff when I was younger, but obviously that dropped away because you can't carry one of those anywhere. They wouldn't let it on the plane. So these days for me, it's the straight sword, the jian for Tai Chi, because I think it epitomizes very much some of the more complex connections in Tai Chi. And the deer horn knives in Bagua, just because my ego likes the way they look. So those are the weapons that I kept more than anything else. I would have loved to have kept the spear, and I still do a little bit, but I'm definitely very shoddy at it these days because, yeah, again, practicalities of weapons for sure. Yes. Yourself, you're a weapons practitioner?
Yeah. I'm in one place, so I got a house full of weapons that I've collected over the last 30 years. I've got loads of weapons I don't even do anymore. Oh, okay. They just take up space in the corner, and my wife yells at me. What are you doing with those things? Get rid of that stuff.
So you've got lots of outdoor space in Colorado as well, so perfect.
We do. Yeah. I was going to follow up with that and ask you sort of, when you're teaching weapons, what's the primary focus? Is it more like Shinfa development? Is it more of a strength practice, or is it more, we're teaching you how to use the weapon, or something, some combination maybe?
Yeah, well, especially the main weapon that I would teach is the straight sword in Tai Chi, the Jian. And for me, I teach fencing with it. We fence with the swords, which is great fun. But, I'm under no pretense it'll ever be a sort of practical thing. I think the age of dueling with swords for honor, rightly or wrongly, is gone these days. So, so for me, I would talk about other things. But for me, much the sword, especially in Tai Chi, is used. How do I explain this? Okay, so basically you have a series of rotating connections in Tai Chi and the release and all of these things turning inside. For me, the sword is almost like a giant sort of lever, like an amplifier of those rotations. So because I always go for the longest sword I can. So I don't go for this whole, it's supposed to be up to your elbow or something. I want the sword longer than is practical for fighting. Because when you have a very, very long weapon, well, Bagua would agree, obviously, with oversized weapons on. But that giant blade means that those spirals are focused to a further point than the body. So what it does is it creates a high degree of opening and mobilization of the force inside, which when you then return to partner work with empty hands, you can tell it just projects to a different degree. So that's primarily what I use the sword for. And fun. Can't ever deny that. There's something in the male psyche about holding a 4-foot razor blade that's appealing. So
100%.
So would you say with that longer Jian, you have a physical point outside of the body to make sure that you're doing the proper movement on the inside? Is that kind of what you use it for, Damo?
Yeah, very much. And also the amplification of the movement, because say I create a rotation in the center of the body to get power deep inside out towards the hand, then that rotation only has to be very, very small. But if that power has to reach out to the tip of the sword, then that rotation will have to be bigger or more amplified in order to get the power out. So it forces me to be incredibly neat, because if you take a rotation and make it very high, and I mean an internal rotation rather than your sort of skeletal structure, then once it's made big enough to reach the tip, you can suddenly see all the errors in it. You realize it's janky or stuck or something like that. So it neatens it all up. And then when you chuck the sword away and let it all shrink back in, then there's a neatness that comes into the internal force. So I tend to use it more than the Shinfei, like mind development. It's more for me about those kind of things. But I'm not saying that you couldn't use it for higher ended stuff with the weapons. It's just, it's not personally what I use it for. It's not about that for me. It's about cleaning up, but it might be just because I haven't gone deep enough into weapons training myself. Maybe.
Awesome. Well, I don't have anything else. What about you, Randall?
Just if you ever make it back to Colorado, let us know and we'll take you out for a sandwich or a cup of coffee or a beer. I know we actually have really good. As a matter of fact, one of our highlights on the show is we actually got to meet in person and talk to Red Pine. He's a Bill Porter. Yeah. And we didn't know this, but he's a bit of a bourbon drinker. And so we have some great local distilleries that make great bourbon and whiskey. So when you're in town, we'll take you out for a spot of whiskey.
I'll definitely take you up on that because I'll almost certainly be back through Colorado. I go there quite often, so I will take you up on that. Awesome. It's very kind of you guys. The same if you're ever in Bali in the smelly rainforest over here, let me know.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Will do.
But I'll find something nice here.
Damo, thank you for your time. Have a great night. Rest well, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you. Lovely to chat with you.
Talk again soon.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.